welcome. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Or, I might show up at your door. I'm just here to share some creepy stories, so sit back and enjoy. Disclaimer: the content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. From the Bloodstained Journal of Damien Saint-Pierre, Urban Archaeologist. Day 1, October 13, 2024. The granite bled crimson into the reservoir, and the city's heartbeats stuttered. I should have known something was wrong when the pigeons stopped landing on Bethesda Fountain. For 3 weeks, they'd avoided the angel statue entirely, circling overhead in nervous spirals before settling on distant benches. But I was too absorbed in cataloging the recent restoration work to notice the signs. The Parks Department had hired me to document any colonial-era stonework exposed during the fountain's maintenance. Standard procedure: Manhattan's bedrock holds secrets older than the Dutch settlements, and my specialty is reading the stories carved in stone. What I found carved into the fountain's base wasn't Dutch, wasn't English, and sure as hell wasn't in any archaeological database. The symbols were fresh. Not fresh as in recently carved, fresh as in bleeding. I first noticed the wetness seeping from the angel's pedestal around dawn. Dark red rivulets traced the grooves of what looked like runic script, pooling in the basin below. The maintenance crew had drained the fountain 2 days prior, but this wasn't residual water. The consistency was wrong, too thick, too warm. When I touched it, the liquid left rust-colored stains on my fingers that wouldn't wash clean. My grandmother would have recognized these symbols. Grandmère Celeste had fled Quebec with stories of protective wards, ancient marks that kept the old hungers at bay. She'd carved similar signs into the foundation stones of our family's Brooklyn brownstone, muttering prayers in French-Canadian patois as she worked. I thought them folklore, superstition. Now, crouched beside the weeping fountain with my camera clicking, I realized she'd been documenting something real. The runes weren't random scratches. They formed a pattern. 7 primary symbols arranged in a circle, with smaller glyphs branching outward like veins. Each symbol pulsed with that viscous red seepage, following a rhythm I couldn't quite place. Too slow for a heartbeat, too fast for breathing. More like the city's subway system, rumbling beneath our feet in measured intervals. I spent the morning photographing every angle, every curve. The symbols seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, growing deeper, more pronounced. By noon, what had been shallow scratches in the granite had become inch-deep gouges, their edges clean as surgical cuts. The temperature around the fountain dropped 15 degrees. My breath misted in the October air, and the red liquid began to steam. That's when I heard the humming. Not human voices, something deeper, more resonant. The sound seemed to rise from the fountain itself, vibrating through the stone and into my bones. Maintenance workers passing by didn't seem to notice, but I felt it in my chest, a thrumming that made my teeth ache. I called my cousin Julian during my lunch break. He spent 20 years in construction, knows Manhattan's underground better than anyone. If these symbols were appearing elsewhere, he'd have seen them. Damien? Yeah, funny you should call. His voice carried that edge it got when he was genuinely unsettled. We've been hitting weird stonework all week. Subway expansion on the 6th line, near Union Square. The granite's got these markings, fresh cuts, but the stone's been there since the 1800s. My blood chilled. Can you describe them? Circles and slashes, mostly. They're bleeding some kind of red shit, probably iron oxide, but it's got the crew spooked. Foreman wants to jackhammer them smooth, but the union's pushing back. Nobody wants to touch the stuff. I felt the weight of my grandmother's warnings settling on my shoulders. Julian, listen carefully. Don't let them damage those symbols. Not yet. What? Why? Because I think they're connected to something bigger. Something that's been waiting. The humming from the fountain grew louder as I spoke, and I watched the red liquid begin to bubble. Steam rose in twisted spirals, carrying the scent of copper and sulfur. Around the park, joggers continued their routines, oblivious to the ancient hunger stirring beneath their feet. "I need to document this," I told Julian. "Whatever's happening, Grandmere's stories suggest these symbols are either protective wards or what?" I watched the crimson seepage overflow the fountain's basin, seeping into the earth around the pedestal. The grass withered where it touched, leaving black scorch marks in perfect geometric patterns. Or there's something much worse. That evening, I returned to the fountain with my full archaeological kit: ground-penetrating radar, core samples, spectrometer. The symbols had grown again, spreading beyond the pedestal to cover nearly half the fountain's base. The humming was constant now, a low drone that seemed to emanate from deep underground. The radar revealed cavities beneath the fountain, not natural caves, but carved chambers extending down into Manhattan's schist bedrock. The architecture was wrong, too angular, too deliberate. These weren't utility tunnels or subway infrastructure. They were something older, something that predated European settlement by centuries. As I packed my equipment, a Parks Department security guard approached. Middle-aged, tired eyes, the kind of man who'd seen enough of the city's strangeness to know when not to ask questions. "You're the archaeologist, right? The one documenting the fountain." I nodded, watching him eye the spreading symbols with obvious unease. "My grandfather worked these grounds back in the 30s, he said quietly. "Always told stories about the old stones, how they'd bleed when something bad was coming. Said it happened before the stock market crash, before the war, before September 11th. He handed me a business card: Detective Tyson McPherson, NYPD. Friend of mine downtown. He's been tracking some weird incidents around the city. Might want to give him a call." The security guard walked away, but his words echoed in my mind. As I looked back at the fountain, now completely covered in pulsing red symbols, I realized this wasn't just archaeological curiosity anymore. This was a warning, and Manhattan was bleeding. From the bloodstained journal of Damien Saint-Pierre, urban archaeologist. Day 3, October 15th, 2024. The bedrock screamed as ancient hunger stirred beneath our feet. I called Detective McPherson at 6 a.m. after spending a sleepless night watching the fountain symbols pulse with increasing intensity. The red seepage had spread beyond the pedestal, creeping across the concrete walkways in branching patterns that looked disturbingly like arterial networks. By dawn, the entire fountain plaza resembled a massive circulatory system bleeding into the earth. McPherson's voice was gravelly, tired. "Saint-Pierre?" "Yeah, park security gave me your number. You're the one tracking the bleeding stones." "Detective, I need to know. Are you seeing similar phenomena elsewhere in the city?" Pause. Papers rustling. "Depends what you mean by similar. We've had reports of red liquid seeping from subway gratings, steam vents in the financial district, even the foundation of City Hall. Most of it's been written off as rust, old pipes, construction runoff." "It's not rust." I stared at the fountain, where the symbols now covered the entire angel statue. The stone figure's face had changed, its serene expression twisted into something resembling hunger. "Detective, I think we're dealing with something that's been dormant under Manhattan for a very long time." "How long?" "Centuries. Maybe longer." The line went quiet. Then, "I'll be in Central Park in an hour. Don't touch anything else." While I waited, I called Julian. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Damien, thank God. We had to evacuate the Union Square site. The whole tunnel system's compromised." "What happened?" "The symbols you warned me about, they're everywhere now. Not just the walls, but the ceiling, the support beams, even the goddamn electrical conduits. And they're not just bleeding anymore. They're moving." My mouth went dry. "Moving how?" "Like they're alive. Pulsing, spreading, growing deeper. The red stuff isn't just seeping, it's flowing in patterns, like it's following some kind of circuit. And the smell? Jesus Christ, the smell. Describe it." "Copper and sulfur, but underneath that, something else. Something that makes your stomach turn." like meat that's been rotting in the sun for weeks. I thought of Grandmere Celeste's stories, the warnings about old hungers waking when the protective wards failed. Julian, I need you to listen carefully. Are any of your crew touching the symbols directly? No, but 3 guys got sick just being near them. Nausea, vertigo, nosebleeds. We called in a hazmat team, but their equipment's going haywire. Geiger counters are screaming, but it's not radiation. It's something else. Through the phone, I heard a distant rumbling. Not traffic, something deeper, more primal. Julian, where are you right now? Still at the site. The hazmat team's packing up, but I wanted to. The line went dead. I tried calling back, but it went straight to voicemail. My hands shook as I stared at the fountain, where the red liquid was now bubbling like a cauldron. The humming had grown into a low roar, and I could feel vibrations through the soles of my feet. Detective McPherson arrived as the first subway train of the morning shuddered to a halt beneath us. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen more than his share of the city's dark secrets. "Show me," he said without preamble. I led him to the fountain, watching his expression change from skepticism to grim acceptance as he took in the spreading symbols, the steaming red liquid, the twisted angel statue. How long has it been like this? 3 days, but it's accelerating. The symbols are spreading faster, the bleeding's more intense, and I hesitated. "Detective, I think this is connected to something much larger." My cousin's construction crew found matching symbols in the subway system. McPherson pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like incident reports. Financial District, City Hall, Union Square, now Central Park. If this is some kind of pattern, a tremor ran through the ground beneath us. Not an earthquake, something more focused, more deliberate. The fountain's angel statue shuddered, and cracks appeared in its stone wings. "We need to evacuate the area," McPherson said, but his voice was drowned out by a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Screaming, not human screams. Something else, something that had been trapped underground for centuries and was finally clawing its way to the surface. The fountain exploded in a geyser of red liquid, spraying the crimson substance across the plaza in geometric patterns. Where it landed, the concrete cracked, releasing more of that sulfurous, rotting smell. McPherson grabbed my arm. "We need to move. Now." As we ran from the plaza, I looked back to see the fountain's angel statue splitting apart, its stone shell cracking like an eggshell. Something dark and writhing moved within the cracks, pressing against the stone from the inside. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Construction site collapsed. Julian trapped. Meet me at Union Square emergency staging area."
J. Marcotte Construction, site foreman.
But that was impossible. Julian was the site foreman. McPherson saw my face. "What is it?" "My cousin. He's trapped in the subway collapse, but someone's using his name." Another tremor shook the ground, stronger this time. In the distance, I could hear sirens, car alarms, the general chaos of a city under assault by something it didn't understand. "Detective, I need to get to Union Square. If the symbols are connected, if they're part of some larger ritual, then we need to understand what they're trying to summon," McPherson finished. "And we need to stop it before it's too late." As we reached his patrol car, the humming from the fountain had become a roar. The red liquid was flowing in rivers now, following the sidewalk cracks toward the subway entrances. And somewhere beneath the city, I could hear answering calls, stone voices waking from their ancient sleep. The bedrock of Manhattan was singing, and its song was one of hunger. We drove through increasingly chaotic streets toward Union Square, where emergency vehicles surrounded a massive sinkhole that had opened where the subway construction should have been. The hole was perfectly circular, its edges carved with the same symbols that had covered the fountain. And from its depths, something that had been waiting centuries was finally beginning to climb. Day 4, October 16th, 2024. The skyscrapers birthed monsters from their bleeding foundations. The Union Square sinkhole stretched 40 feet across, its edges perfectly smooth as if carved by surgical precision. Emergency crews had cordoned off a 6-block radius, but their equipment kept malfunctioning near the pit's edge. Radios crackled with static, flashlights dimmed to nothing, and 3 different generators had simply died when brought within 50 yards of the hole. Detective McPherson flashed his badge at the perimeter guards. "NYPD consultant," he said, nodding toward me. "Archaeological assessment." The lie got us through, but nothing could have prepared us for what waited at the sinkhole's rim. The walls weren't natural stone or concrete. They were lined with the same symbols I'd found at the fountain, but these were massive, each rune stretching 8 feet tall, carved deep into bedrock that shouldn't have existed at this depth. The symbols pulsed with that familiar red seepage, but down here, the liquid moved with purpose, flowing in complex patterns that hurt to follow with your eyes. "Jesus," McPherson whispered. "How far down does it go?" I dropped a piece of concrete into the darkness. We counted 15 seconds before hearing it hit bottom, followed by a sound like grinding stone and something that might have been breathing. "Detective," a voice behind us made us both jump. "I've been looking for you." The man approaching was tall, thin, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place among the emergency crews. His hair was prematurely gray, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much. "Elias Boucher," he said, extending a hand. "I worked for Meridian Development Group. We need to talk." McPherson's expression hardened. "Meridian? That's the company that's been buying up half the financial district." Among other things, Boucher's voice carried a weight of exhaustion and guilt. "Detective, Mr. St. Pierre, what you're seeing here isn't natural. It's not geological and it's not accidental. It's the result of a very old, very deliberate ritual that my former employers have been working to complete for the past 5 years." I stared at him. "You're saying this is corporate?" "I'm saying this is much worse than corporate." Boucher pulled out a tablet, showing us architectural plans overlaid with the same runic symbols. "Meridian isn't just a development company. It's a front for something that's been operating in this city since the Dutch colonial period. They've been identifying and acquiring properties built over specific geological formations, then systematically weakening the barriers that keep certain things contained." McPherson grabbed the tablet, scrolling through what looked like dozens of construction sites throughout Manhattan. "All of these locations are built over nexus points," Boucher finished. "Places where the old stones were placed to contain what lies beneath. Your fountain in Central Park, the subway expansion at Union Square, the foundation work at the World Trade Center Memorial, the renovation of Trinity Church, all of them have been compromised." A new tremor shook the ground, and from the sinkhole came a sound like massive stone blocks grinding against each other. The emergency crews backed away as red liquid began fountaining from the pit, splashing against the surrounding buildings in patterns that left scorch marks on glass and steel. "What exactly are they trying to release?" I asked, though part of me already knew from Grandmere's stories. "The city's original inhabitants," Boucher said quietly. "The things that were here before the Lenape, before the Ice Age, before human memory. They've been sleeping in the bedrock for millennia, but the old Dutch settlers knew enough to bind them. Stone seals, protective wards, symbols of containment carved into the very foundation of New Amsterdam." The grinding sound from the sinkhole intensified, and I saw McPherson's face go pale as something large shifted in the depths. "They're waking up," he said. "Worse, they're climbing up." Boucher pointed to the sinkhole's walls, where new cracks were appearing. "The ritual requires 7 primary breach points across Manhattan. We've seen 4 activate in the past week. When the 7th opens, he didn't need to finish. The implications were clear. Where are the other sites?" McPherson demanded. Boucher swiped through more architectural plans. "Financial District, that's where the Master Ritual Circle is located, in the old Federal Hall foundations. Brooklyn Bridge approaches, where they're reinforcing the support structures. And," he hesitated, "one we haven't identified yet. The pattern suggests it's somewhere in Midtown, but Meridian's been very careful to hide their final location. A new sound joined the grinding from below, a rhythmic pounding, like something massive hammering against stone. The emergency crews were retreating further now, their equipment sparking and failing as the red liquid spread in wider patterns. "We need to get down there," I said. "If Julian's trapped, your cousin is already dead," Boucher said bluntly. "I'm sorry, but nothing human survives direct contact with the awakening process. What you received yesterday wasn't a message from him. It was from something wearing his memories." The pounding stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that made my teeth ache. A deep, resonant humming that seemed to come from the stones themselves. The sinkhole's edges began to crack, widening the pit, and I could see movement in the depths. "They're coming," McPherson said, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon. "Bullets won't stop them," Boucher warned. "They're not flesh and blood. They're living stone, animated by the same force that's been seeping from the breach points. The old settlers called them the hunger that walks, because they consume everything organic they touch, converting it into more of themselves." The first appendage emerged from the sinkhole, a massive limb that might have been an arm or a leg, carved from the same granite as the surrounding bedrock but moving with impossible fluidity. It was followed by another, then another, as something the size of a small building began hauling itself out of the pit. "What do we do?" McPherson asked, backing away as the creature's head emerged. A grotesque fusion of stone and malice, with eyes that burned with the same red light as the bleeding symbols. "We find the master site," Boucher said. "Federal Hall. If we can disrupt the ritual there before all 7 breaches open, we can stop this? We can try." Boucher was already moving toward the perimeter, pulling out his phone. "But we need to move fast. The pattern suggests the final breach will occur within the next 12 hours. As we ran from the plaza, I looked back to see the stone creature fully emerged from the sinkhole, standing 3 stories tall and beginning to move toward the surrounding buildings. Where its feet touched the pavement, the asphalt cracked and bled. Behind it, more shapes were climbing from the depths. Manhattan was giving birth to nightmares, and we were running out of time to stop the delivery. Day 5, October 17th, 2024. Manhattan's veins burst open, drowning Broadway in ancient wrath. The subway tunnels beneath Federal Hall ran red with something that wasn't quite blood. Boucher led us through maintenance corridors that Meridian had been upgrading for months, past walls where fresh concrete barely concealed the pulsing symbols beneath. The air grew thick with the smell of copper and sulfur, and every step echoed with the sound of grinding stone from somewhere deeper in the earth. "The master ritual chamber is directly below the old Federal Hall foundations," Boucher explained, his voice barely audible over the growing rumble. "They've been channeling the energy from the other breach points through the subway system, using the original Dutch drainage tunnels as conduits." McPherson checked his radio again. Still nothing but static. "How do we know your intel is good? This could be a trap." "Because I helped design it," Boucher said quietly. "Before I understood what we were really building." The tunnel opened into a vast chamber that had no right to exist beneath downtown Manhattan. The walls were lined with the same bleeding runes, but these were ancient, carved into stone that predated human civilization. At the center of the chamber stood a perfect circle of 7 pillars, each one pulsing with that horrible red light. 6 of the pillars were active, their surfaces crawling with symbols that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. The 7th stood dark and silent, but as we watched, hairline cracks began appearing in its surface. "The final breach," I whispered. "Not yet," Boucher said, "but close. Maybe 30 minutes. That's when we heard Julian's voice echoing from somewhere in the darkness beyond the pillars. "Damien, Jesus Christ, help me." McPherson grabbed my arm as I started forward. "Remember what Boucher said. It's not him." But the voice came again, desperate and terrified. "The concrete won't hold. The whole foundation is coming apart. Please, I'm trapped down here." I knew it wasn't really Julian. I knew it was something else, something that had consumed his memories and was using them as bait. But hearing my cousin's voice, hearing the fear in it, it cut through logic like a blade. "Damien, no!" McPherson shouted, but I was already running toward the sound. The chamber beyond the pillars was a nightmare of twisted architecture. The walls bulged and shifted like living tissue, and the floor was covered in a pool of the red liquid that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. And there, suspended in the center of the pool, was something that looked like Julian but couldn't be. The thing wearing my cousin's face was embedded in the wall itself. Its lower body merged with the stone as if it had been growing there. Its eyes were the same burning red as the symbols, and when it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that made my bones ache. "I tried to seal the breach," it said with Julian's voice, "but the concrete, it became part of me, part of the ritual. I'm feeding it now, Damien, feeding it everything I was." "You're not Julian," I said, backing away from the pool. "I'm what's left of him," the creature replied. "And I'm what you'll become if you don't stop this. The ritual is almost complete. When the seventh pillar activates, every building in Manhattan will become a breach point. The entire city will birth them." The grinding sound grew louder, and I felt the floor tremble beneath my feet. From the main chamber, I could hear McPherson and Boucher shouting over the noise of collapsing masonry. "The pillars are synchronizing." Boucher's voice carried panic. "We need to get out of here." But as I turned to leave, the thing that had been Julian spoke one last time. "The Times Square subway junction. That's where the real ritual is happening. This is just the trigger." I ran back to the main chamber to find McPherson and Boucher staring at the seventh pillar, which was now glowing with the same red light as the others. The symbols on all 7 pillars were moving faster now, spiraling upward in complex patterns that hurt to follow. "It's starting," Boucher said. "The master ritual." The chamber began to shake, and chunks of concrete rained from the ceiling. But the worst part was the sound. A deep, resonant humming that seemed to come from the stone itself, growing louder and more complex as the pillars synchronized their energies. "We need to get to Times Square," I said, grabbing Boucher's arm. "Julian, what's left of him? He said the real ritual is at the subway junction." "That's impossible," Boucher protested. "The master site is here. I designed it myself." His words were cut off as the chamber floor cracked open, revealing not bedrock but a vast space filled with moving darkness. And from that darkness came the sound of something immense stirring to life. We ran. The subway tunnels were chaos. Emergency lighting flickered and died as we passed, leaving us stumbling through darkness lit only by the red glow seeping from cracks in the walls. The humming sound followed us, growing stronger, and I could feel it in my teeth, in my bones, in the rhythm of my heartbeat. At 42nd Street, we emerged into a Times Square that looked like a war zone. The massive LED screens were dark, their surfaces cracked and bleeding that same red liquid. The famous red steps were buckled and broken, and the naked cowboy statue lay shattered, its bronze fragments scattered across pavement that pulsed with runic symbols. "Dear God," McPherson whispered. The entire intersection was one massive ritual circle. The symbols were carved into the streets themselves, hidden beneath decades of asphalt and concrete but now exposed and bleeding. At the center of the circle, where the subway entrances converged, the pavement had collapsed into a perfect spiral staircase leading down into darkness. "The real master site," Boucher said, his voice hollow with realization. "They've been using Federal Hall as a decoy. This is where it all leads." People were running, screaming, but there was nowhere to go. The stone creatures we'd seen at Union Square were everywhere now. Dozens of them, each one the size of a building, moving through the streets like living avalanches. They left trails of destruction in their wake, and wherever they touched, the buildings themselves began to change, sprouting the same bleeding symbols. "It's too late," Boucher said. "The ritual is complete. Manhattan is becoming one giant breach point." But McPherson was already moving, running toward the spiral staircase. "Maybe we can still disrupt it," he shouted over the sound of crumbling skyscrapers. If we can get to the source. A massive stone hand smashed down where he'd been standing a second before. The creature that had emerged from the spiral was larger than the others, its surface covered in symbols that blazed with red fire. It turned toward us with eyes like burning coals, and I could see intelligence there. Ancient, alien, and utterly hostile. "Run!" I shouted, but McPherson was already drawing his weapon. "Get Boucher to the staircase," he called back. "I'll buy you time." I wanted to argue, to tell him bullets wouldn't work, but there was no time. The stone giant was reaching for us with arms that could crush cars, and McPherson was already firing, his shots sparking off the creature's hide but drawing its attention. Boucher and I ran for the spiral staircase as McPherson led the creature away, still firing, still shouting defiance at something that was beyond human comprehension. The last I saw of him, he was standing in the center of Broadway, surrounded by 3 of the stone giants, his gun blazing as they closed in. The staircase led down into darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. Behind us, Manhattan burned and bled, giving birth to nightmares that had slept beneath its foundations for millennia. And somewhere in that darkness below, I could hear something vast and patient stirring to full wakefulness. The thing that had been waiting for this moment since before the first human had ever set foot on this island. The real ritual was just beginning. Day 5, October 17th, 2024, 11:47 p.m. His blood joined the sigils, and the city's bones cracked with hunger. The spiral staircase descended for what felt like miles, carved from living bedrock that pulsed with veins of that crimson seepage. Each step down took us deeper into Manhattan's buried heart, past layers of history that had been deliberately hidden. Dutch colonial foundations, Native American burial grounds, and beneath it all, something far older. Boucher moved ahead of me, his tablet screen providing our only light. The device should have died hours ago, but the same energy that fed the bleeding runes seemed to sustain it, displaying architectural plans that shifted and changed as we descended. "The original Dutch settlers knew," he said, his voice echoing in the narrow passage. "They found the old stones, the containment barriers, but instead of leaving them alone, they built their city as a secondary containment system. Every major building, every street grid, every subway tunnel, it's all one massive binding sigil." I thought of Grandmere's stories about the old ways, the protective wards our family had maintained for generations. And Meridian has been systematically destroying it. Not destroying, redirecting. Boucher stopped at a junction where 3 passages converged, each one carved with symbols that seemed to writhe in the tablet's light. "The binding energy has been building for centuries. We've been channeling it, concentrating it, until there was enough power to break the original seals." The passage opened into a vast chamber that took my breath away. The walls stretched up into darkness, covered in symbols that weren't carved but seemed to grow from the stone itself. In the center of the chamber stood a perfect circle of 13 monoliths, each one twice the height of a man and covered in the same writhing runes. And suspended in the air above the circle, rotating slowly like some impossible mobile, were dozens of objects that I recognized with horrible clarity. "The missing construction workers," I whispered. They hung there like grotesque ornaments, their bodies partially transformed into stone, suspended by threads of crystallized blood that connected them to the monoliths below. Their eyes were open, burning with that same red light, and as we watched, their mouths moved in perfect synchronization, chanting in a language that predated human speech. "The ritual requires willing sacrifice," Boucher explained, his voice hollow with guilt. "But when volunteers became scarce, Meridian started using the construction crews. They told them it was a safety procedure, a new kind of foundation stabilization. The workers thought they were just applying some experimental concrete mixture." One of the suspended figures turned its head toward us, and I saw with horror that it was Julian. His lower body had been transformed into the same granite as the monoliths, but his face was still recognizably human, still recognizably my cousin. When he spoke, his voice carried the harmonics of the ancient chant. "I tried to warn you," he said, his words perfectly synchronized with the others. I tried to send a message, but the ritual, it consumes everything. Memory, identity, soul. We're all part of it now. Julian, I started forward, but Boucher grabbed my arm. Don't, he warned. Physical contact with the transformed will add you to the ritual. That's how it spreads. But I couldn't look away from my cousin's face, from the pain and awareness that still flickered in his burning eyes. Can we free them? Only by completing the ritual, Julian answered, his voice now perfectly in harmony with the others. Or by destroying it entirely. But the second option will kill everyone in Manhattan. The chanting grew louder, and I felt the chamber tremble as something vast stirred beneath us. The monoliths began to glow brighter, and the suspended figures rotated faster, their stone appendages reaching toward the chamber's ceiling. What's beneath us? I asked. Boucher consulted his tablet, swiping through layers of geological data. According to the old Dutch records, it's called the Sleeper in Stone, the original inhabitant of this island, from before the Ice Age, before human memory. It's been dormant for millennia, but the ritual is designed to wake it, and then it reclaims its territory. Boucher's voice was barely audible over the chanting, starting with Manhattan and spreading outward. Every major city on the East Coast has similar containment systems, similar binding sigils. Once the sleeper wakes, it will call to its siblings buried beneath Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. The chamber floor cracked open, revealing glimpses of something immense moving in the darkness below. I caught sight of what might have been an eye, large enough to swallow a subway car, opening and closing with the rhythm of the chant. How long do we have? I asked. Minutes, Boucher said. The ritual is almost complete. Once the sleeper fully wakes, the transformation will spread through the city's infrastructure. Every building, every street, every person will become part of its body. That's when I heard McPherson's voice echoing from somewhere in the darkness beyond the monoliths. Damien, you need to get out of there. I spun around, searching the shadows. Tyson? How are you? I'm not, came the reply, and I saw him stumble into the chamber's light. But this wasn't the McPherson I'd known. His body was covered in the same stone transformation as the construction workers, granite spreading up from his feet like some horrible disease. The creatures up there, they don't kill you. They convert you, add you to the ritual. He collapsed near the entrance, his legs now completely stone, the transformation creeping up his torso. I managed to hold onto enough of myself to follow you down here, but not for long. Tyson, listen to me, he said, his voice already taking on the harmonic quality of the chant. The ritual has a failsafe. Meridian built it in case they needed to abort, but using it will bring down half of Manhattan. Boucher looked up from his tablet. The explosive charges in the subway tunnels. They're not for construction, they're for controlled demolition. If we trigger them all at once, the ritual circle breaks, McPherson finished. The sleeper goes back to sleep, but the blast will collapse everything from Herald Square to Wall Street. The chanting reached a crescendo, and I felt the chamber shake as something vast and ancient began to rise from the depths. The suspended figures were rotating faster now, their stone appendages reaching toward the ceiling, and I could see cracks appearing in the chamber walls. How do we trigger the charges? I asked. McPherson held up a device that looked like a modified radio. Emergency demolition control. I took it from the Meridian site supervisor before the creatures got me. But someone has to stay behind to activate it. The signal won't reach the surface. The transformation was spreading faster now, reaching his chest. In minutes, he would be completely consumed. Another voice in the ritual's chorus. I'll do it, I said. No. Boucher stood up, his face resolute. This is my responsibility. I helped design this nightmare. I should be the one to end it. Elias, take McPherson's radio, he said, pressing the device into my hands. Get to the surface. When you hear the explosion, use the emergency frequency to coordinate evacuation. There might be survivors. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound like grinding consonants. The sleeper was waking, and I could feel its attention turning toward us. Vast, alien, and utterly hostile. "Go!" Boucher shouted, pulling out his own device. "I'll give you as much time as I can." I ran for the spiral staircase as the chamber began to collapse around us. Behind me, I could hear Boucher's voice joining the chant, but fighting against it, trying to maintain enough of himself to complete his final task. The climb to the surface felt like it took hours, but it couldn't have been more than minutes. I emerged into a Times Square that no longer resembled anything human. The buildings had transformed into massive stone pillars covered in bleeding runes, and the sky was filled with creatures that moved like living architecture. I found shelter in what had once been a subway entrance and keyed the radio to the emergency frequency. "This is Damien Saint-Pierre," I said, "archaeological consultant. I'm in Times Square. If anyone can hear this, you need to evacuate the area immediately. There's going to be..." The explosion came from beneath, a rumble that shook the entire island. The transformed buildings began to crack and crumble, the stone creatures freezing in place as their connection to the ritual was severed. The sky cleared, and for a moment, Manhattan was almost quiet. Then the real collapse began. I watched from my shelter as half of Midtown folded in on itself, the streets opening like hungry mouths, swallowing everything that had been touched by the transformation. The sound was indescribable, like the city itself was screaming as it died. When the dust settled, I was alone in the ruins of what had once been the crossroads of the world. The radio crackled with static, but occasionally I caught fragments of voices. Survivors, rescue teams, people asking what had happened. I looked down at my hands and saw that my fingers were stained with something that wasn't quite blood. The ritual was broken. The sleeper had returned to its slumber. But the cost. Julian was gone. McPherson was gone. Boucher was gone. And with them, any chance of explaining what had really happened beneath Manhattan streets. But I was still alive. And I still had Grandmere's ward symbols, the protective knowledge that had been passed down through generations of my family. The city would rebuild. It always did. But this time, I would make sure it was built right. This time, I would make sure the old protections were not forgotten. Day 7, October 19th, 2024, dawn. The city weeps stone tears, but ward-carved rubble holds the line. I write this in the ruins of the New York Public Library, surrounded by the ghosts of what Manhattan used to be. The morning light filters through collapsed sections of the roof, illuminating walls that still bear the faint traces of bleeding runes. Dormant now, but not dead. Never dead. The official story is a gas explosion, a catastrophic failure in the subway system that caused a domino effect of infrastructure collapse. The media calls it the worst disaster in New York's history, but they have no idea how close they came to losing everything. I know better. I've spent the last 2 days walking through the ruins, documenting what really happened, and more importantly, what's still happening. The sleeper didn't die when Boucher triggered the demolition charges. It merely went back to sleep, sinking deeper into the bedrock beneath Manhattan. But sleep isn't the same as containment, and the old Dutch binding sigils are broken beyond repair. The city's protective grid has been shattered, leaving gaps that something ancient and patient is already beginning to exploit. I found the first new breach yesterday, in the basement of a building that survived the collapse. A crack in the foundation no wider than my thumb, but it pulsed with that familiar red seepage. By this morning, it had spread to the size of my fist, and I could hear something stirring in the darkness beyond. The wards I carved into the surrounding concrete have slowed its growth, but they won't stop it permanently. Grandmere's symbols were designed to reinforce existing barriers, not create new ones from nothing. For that, I need something stronger. I need the original stones. The demolition exposed layers of Manhattan's history that had been buried for centuries. In the crater where Times Square used to be, I found fragments of the Dutch containment system, granite blocks carved with symbols that predate European colonization. Native American work, but older than any tribe that left written records. The stones were broken, scattered, but not destroyed. And more importantly, they still held power. I could feel it humming in the granite, a patient strength that had been waiting for someone who understood its purpose. It took me a day to gather enough fragments to begin the work. Another day to understand how they fit together, how the symbols connected to form a pattern that wasn't just protective but actively repulsive to the things that slept beneath the city. The new barrier wouldn't cover all of Manhattan. I don't have the resources or the time for that. But I could create a perimeter around the worst damage, a ring of protection that would hold long enough for the natural barriers to heal. If I was willing to pay the price, the old stones required a guardian, someone who would become part of the barrier itself. The Dutch settlers understood this, which is why they built their city as a secondary containment system. They spread the burden across thousands of people, each one contributing a small part of their life force to maintain the protective grid. But I was alone, and the damage was too extensive for half measures. I set up the first ward stone in the crater where Federal Hall used to be, carving my family's symbols into the granite with tools salvaged from the ruins. The process was agonizing. Each symbol required blood, not just to activate but to bind. By the time I finished the first stone, my hands were raw and stained with something that wasn't quite blood. The second stone went in the subway tunnel beneath Union Square, where the original breach had occurred. The tunnel was flooded with that red seepage, and I had to wade through liquid that burned like acid to reach the foundation. The stone had to be placed precisely at the exact center of the ritual circle that Meridian had carved into the bedrock. As I worked, I could feel the sleeper's attention turning toward me. Not waking, not yet, but aware that something was interfering with its slow return to consciousness. The liquid around my feet began to bubble and hiss, and I could hear that grinding sound from somewhere far below. But the stone held. The symbols flared with protective light, and the seepage began to recede. The third stone was the hardest. It had to go in the heart of the old ritual chamber, where Boucher had made his final sacrifice. The spiral staircase was blocked with rubble, but I found another way down through the damaged subway tunnels. The chamber was a tomb now, filled with the crystallized remains of the construction workers who had been consumed by the ritual. Their bodies had turned to stone when the binding was broken, leaving them as permanent monuments to Meridian's crime. Julian was there, frozen in the same position where I'd last seen him, his eyes closed but his face peaceful. For the first time since the ritual began, he looked like he was truly at rest. I placed the third stone at the center of the original circle, where the 13 monoliths had stood. The symbols I carved were different from the others, not just protective but commemorative. A memorial to the men who had died here, and a warning to anyone who might try to wake the sleeper again. The work took 3 days. 3 days of cutting symbols into stone, of bleeding into granite, of feeling my life force drain away with each ward I activated. By the end, I could barely stand, and my reflection in the broken glass showed a man who had aged years in the span of a week. But the barrier held. The red seepage stopped spreading, the new cracks sealed themselves, and the grinding sound from below faded to silence. The sleeper was contained once more. I'm writing this final entry because I can feel the change beginning. The ward stones are linked to me now, connected to my life force in a way that will make me part of Manhattan's foundation. I won't die exactly, but I won't be fully human either. I'll become something like the old Dutch guardians, a living component of the city's protective grid. The process is already starting. My hands are harder now, more like stone than flesh. When I touch the ward stones, I can feel the city's heartbeat, the slow pulse of 8 million lives going about their daily business, unaware of what sleeps beneath their feet. I've hidden copies of this journal in 3 different locations, along with detailed maps of the new ward network and instructions for maintaining it. Someone will need to take over when I'm gone. Someone who understands the old ways and isn't afraid to pay the price for protection. The city will rebuild. It always does. But this time, it will be built on a foundation of truth instead of lies, protected by barriers that won't be broken by corporate greed or human ambition. The sleeper will wake again someday. That's inevitable. But when it does, Manhattan will be ready. I can hear them now, construction crews, rescue workers, city planners making their assessments of the damage. They're talking about rebuilding, about making the city stronger than before. They have no idea how literally true that statement is. Let them build. Let them plan. Let them create their new Manhattan on the bones of the old. I'll be watching from the stones, making sure the barriers hold, making sure the old protections are not forgotten again. The city weeps stone tears, but ward-carved rubble holds the line. And in the darkness beneath our feet, something ancient and patient settles back into its slumber, waiting for the day when the guardians fail and the barriers fall. But not today, not on my watch. Final entry, Damien Saint-Pierre, October 22nd, 2024. The transformation is complete. I am stone now, and stone is eternal. The barriers will hold as long as Manhattan stands, and when the city falls, others will rise to take its place. The old knowledge survives, carved into granite and blood, waiting for the next generation of guardians. The sleeper dreams beneath our feet, but it dreams alone. Let it stay that way.